To begin, Chapter 3, Once Upon a Time in Big Sur by Clarissa Bell. When Jean Noel was a child, his natural curiosity, as expressed to his mother regarding the identity of his father, was at first met, not unlike Siddhartha Gupta's before him, with vagaries bordering on disdain. At one point, however, Natalie was forced to admit, if only to herself, that Jean Noel's curiosity could not be sloughed off as idle, and that the child indeed deserved to be given some inkling of an idea as to who his father actually was. And so it was, just before Jean Noel's departure for boarding school in Paris, at the tender age of 6, that Natalie at last found the courage to speak the truth to the child about his father, or at least some semblance thereof.
I didn't really know your father all that well. Natalie had begun tentatively as she and Jean Noel shared a basket of French fries, sprinkled generously with celery salt, and sat around the outdoor circular fireplace in the patio of the Brentwood Country Mart, one typically overcast day in June. And I was prevented from ever getting to know him better because, and here Natalie took out what Jean Noel could only have considered to be the worst possible moment, a pause, oblivious to the clearly posted signs that hung about the patio, advising patrons not to feed the birds. Natalie had chosen that precise moment at which to fling a French fry under the bench upon which she sat to a rock dove who had been milling about around her feet. No sooner had she done this, however, than a few more rock doves spontaneously appeared, and to whom she obligatorily flung a few more French fries. If Natalie was using the birds as a convenient distraction from the subject at hand, she quickly forced herself to refocus, for Jean Noel's sake, as the boy was clearly hanging on her every word. Because, she reiterated, picking up where she'd left off and clearing her throat in an effort to buy just a little more time before taking the plunge, saying as nonchalantly as possible, he was swept out to sea.
An ominous silence hung in the air between them as Jean Noel wrestled with this patently bizarre pronouncement, so perfunctorily made. At long last, he asked him, "How?"
Oh, his mother replied, as offhandedly as she could. That kind of thing just happens up there a lot.
Jean Noel understood up to that to mean a both magical and treacherous place known as Big Sur, where he had been born. "Are you sure?" the child queried, further in honest disbelief. "Was he swimming or something?" he suggested helpfully, unable, as he was, to understand how such an event could occur.
No, Natalie informed her son. The water's too cold up there for that. He was walking his dog on the beach, that's all. In her own attempts at being helpful, Natalie had only added to Jean Noel's consternation.
"Then how?" the child demanded, once more in earnest.
In Big Sur, the ocean has this weird way of sneaking up on you, then it knocks you off your feet, sucks you into the sea, and never gives you back. Natalie said this quite matter-of-factly, as she strove for a practical way to explain his father's tragic demise.
"I don't believe you," Jean Noel replied, almost grinning, so sure that he and his mother was only kidding.
Well, many people don't believe it, and that's why it happens every year to so many of them. There are even lots of warning signs posted on the beaches, but people don't often pay attention to signs, do they? Natalie said this, shaking her head in disparagement, even as she surreptitiously flung another French fry to the rock dove, still waiting patiently beneath her seat.
"But what happened to the dog?" Jean Noel demanded suddenly and with urgent concern.
Well, fortunately, he was a Newfoundland, In other words, a strong swimmer and not afraid of cold water. He managed to survive and to actually save another poor soul who might have drowned that day. Sadly, however, he could not save your father too, Natalie. Soberly, let it be known.
A number of moments passed before Jean Noel then put forth his next important question. What was his name?
Well, whose? Natalie asked back, feebly, feeling a tightening in her throat.
The dog's, Jean Noel cried out in the utter exasperation of a 6-year-old at his mother's sometimes abject inability to grasp the obvious.
Oh, of course. Natalie responded with mock sheepishness, relieved as she was that the child had not meant his father's name. Byron, she then went on to say. Lord Byron, actually, she added with deep affection as she reached out to stroke her son's own shaggy head.
The next part, 20 years later. Chapter 6.
My name is Christy O'Keefe, and I hear you're looking for me.
Jean Noel had been nursing a pint of dark ale along with a basket of fries, or golden loons, as they were known at Nepenthe, sprinkled liberally with salt, while he was sitting at the restaurant's semicircular patio with its broad and sweeping view of the rugged south coast. A gentleman of a certain age had just then planted himself on the seat and beside the young man and pointedly identified himself. Having arrived at Big Sur, but 2 days prior, Jean Noel had first secured a primitive cabin in Fernwood, the campground, and then headed directly to Nepenthe, where he knew his mother had been a busgirl so many years ago. It made sense, therefore, to query some of the more senior members of the staff, none of whom, however, had any recollection of a busgirl named Natalie from days gone by. It had been suggested that Jean Noel return on Wednesday and talk to a former dishwasher with an encyclopedic memory who would stop by for a pot of tea, not just the bag of its essence, as it's stated in the menu. The obligatory peanut butter sandwich, a peanut butter cookie as well. Every week, I'll say, there he was.
Christy O'Keefe worked there years ago as a full-time dishwasher for about a decade while he painted in oils in his spare time and lived out of an old but trustworthy yellow VW Westphalia. If anyone would remember a bus girl named Natalie who'd worked there circa 1975, Jean Noel had been assured it would definitely be Christy O'Keefe.
I am looking for you, Jean Noel said, answering the older man's query in the affirmative. Can I buy you a beer?
I'm afraid my drinking days are over, son. But I will take a basket of them golden plumes and a pink lemonade, thank you very much. By the way, what's your name? Christy asked this as he pilfered a French fry from Jean Noel's basket and noted with some alarm the absence of what he referred to as ambrosia sauce. Can't eat these things without ambrosia sauce, son. It's part of the Nepenthe experience. Order us a bunch of it, he further instructed. Jean Noel, he further instructed Jean Noel, seeming to have forgotten the question the young man had originally put forth.
Conveniently ignoring the question himself, Jean Noel forged ahead with his fact-finding mission, thinking his own anonymity might prove a valuable asset as he got closer to the truth. After placing their order with the server and stressing the need for an extra ambrosia sauce, Jean Noel set about describing Natalie and her mother as best she could, and was pleased when he saw an immediate glint of recognition flicker across Christy's thoughtful eyes.
Of course I remember. Them's the ones that lived in that goat house down Highway 108 with Byron, he stated matter-of-factly.
Byron? Jean Noel then asked quizzically, trying to place where he'd heard that name before.
Yeah, Byron, Christy went on to explain. Big burly dude, kind of like a bear, if you know what I mean. Except in that Byron was real gentle and all.
And you lived with them? Jean Noel remarked, with more than a hint of disbelief.
Well, not at first. You see, me and Byron was best friends. We was what you might call inseparable until them two women showed up. Byron just took to him real strong, and the next thing you know, Christy said, snapping his fingers for emphasis, he was living with them.
Finding this scenario to be growing more and more implausible, Jean Noel only thought to ask, and what did Doc Byron do for a living?
Well, before Byron took up with those two women, he was a lifeguard. He wasn't paid for it or nothing. It was on a purely volunteer basis, but you see, Byron was a real good swimmer, and he weren't afraid of cold water. But more important, Byron could read those sneaker waves like a book. I swear he had a sixth sense. Why, he known when one was coming before it even got close. Old Byron would just spring into action at a moment's notice. He'd gallop out into that crazy surf and bring back anyone in trouble. Heck, sometimes he saved people who didn't even need saving. He just couldn't help himself. He was what you might call a real safety-first kind of guy. At that point, the golden plumes, the pink lemonade, and not insignificantly, the ambrosia sauce arrived. This called for a break in the narrative as Christy proceeded to smother the french fries in a sauce that was primarily mayonnaise mixed with tomato sauce and green chili salsa. Try one, he dared Jean Noel with a knowing wink. You'll never eat a french fry without it again.
Doing as he was told, Jean Noel was pleasantly surprised at the culinary gratification to be thereby experiencing. It was delightful sauce. Serving it a name, he washed it down with a swig of dark ale, even as Christy O'Keefe took a gulp of pink lemonade before continuing.
Near as I can figure, after Byron took up with those women, he just lived to protect them, kind of like a bodyguard. Now, don't get me wrong, old Byron could never hurt a fly, but just his presence was real intimidating, being as he was so huge and all. He made sure nobody messed with them, wouldn't even let some people say hi to them. Not that he ever came at anyone or nothing, but he'd put his big hulky self in front of those women and just stare anybody down real good if he didn't trust them. Those women was safe, no doubt about it, when Byron was around. Christy took another pause and surreptitiously glanced over his shoulder. Seeing no one there save the mythical phoenix bird carved from a massive redwood burl that presided over the patio with its own imposing but silent presence, he stealthily threw a golden plume under the chair on which he sat. It was hastily gobbled up by a rock dove. Now get, he said under his breath to the pigeon, and then sheepishly to Jean Noel. Not supposed to do that.
Strongly reminded of his own mother by this little offense, Jean Noel just smiled and gently prodded the older man to go on, saying, and then?
Oh, and then the baby was born, and Byron looked after that child like a regular nanny. He loved that baby so much, he'd let it pull his hair, tug on his ears, didn't mind a bit. He'd just give that little Dickens a big old kiss is all. I never seen Byron get mad, or even say much, quite honestly. You see, Byron was a real quiet dude, kept his mouth shut most of the time. No problematic thing Byron did do, I reckon, was drool quite a bit from time to time, but nobody held it against him. He just couldn't help it sometimes.
That's weird. Jean Noel observed with some concern. Maybe it was a side effect? Was he on any medications?
Byron? Christy then replied incredulously. Heck no. More likely it was just a hereditary condition. Didn't bother him none.
A bus girl had arrived at that point to clear the basket, now empty of golden plumes, and ask if there would be another round of drinks, which they both declined, realizing that this most informative time with Christy was drawing to a close. Jean Noel asked one more pressing question. And what happened to Byron?
Well, after the younger woman and the baby left to go down to LA, Byron and the older lady went to France together. I heard he had a real nice life in Paris for about 5 years. Then he up and died.
Died? Jean Noel heard himself saying in a gust. Was he sick?
No, I told ya. Byron was as strong as an ox. It's just his time to go is all. Heard he got buried in a real fancy cemetery on the banks of the Seine. Well, I gotta go now myself, Christy O'Keefe said, as he rose abruptly, unable to mask neither the telltale quiver in his voice nor the noticeable dampness in the corner of his eye. I hope that answers some of your questions, Sonny, he added as he hurried away to the comfort of his yellow VW Westphalia, no doubt awaiting him in the parking lot.
And so it was that Jean Noel at last began to understand some of the mystery surrounding his father and reasons why Natalie had not only been reticent to speak of him, but might also have been understandably embarrassed by him. But to go so far as to concoct an entire story about having been swept out to sea and then to have invented a dog with the exact same name seemed to have been nothing short of reducto ad absurdum. And if Zuzu had known Byron as well in Big Sur and actually brought him back to Paris with her, what had been the need for all the secrecy and subterfuge surrounding the man? Jean Noel could see that it would be necessary to have a private word with Zuzu when she came for Natalie's memorial service, which would be held in the Whitmill Chapel, in the meditation garden with the natural spring-fed lake next month. Most definitely a private word indeed. Then, chapter 9. Although Jean Noel had gone to Big Sur without any preconceived notion as to who his father was, other than, of course, an unfortunate soul who had been swept out to sea by a deadly wave, nothing could have prepared him for the noble savage that Byron was, in all likelihood, turning out to be, at least if the first house account of Christy O'Keefe were to be believed. The discovery of his father's true identity was proving, therefore, to be an unsettling experience, and not at all the exhilarating one that Jean Noel was hoping for. But, if anything, it was leaving him emotionally drained, exhausted, and inclined to spend the following 2 days holed up in his primitive cabin there in the Fernwood campground, endlessly dissecting and re-examining this so-called eyewitness account of his father, as told in Jean Noel's estimation, somewhat dubious source. Considering, however, that it was all he had to go on, the account left Jean Noel no choice but to give the strange testimony of Christy O'Keefe the benefit of the doubt. It was somewhat comforting, after all, to learn that Christy considered Byron to be not only gracious and chivalrous by nature, but also protective of those around him to a fault. It was, at the same time, worrisome to learn that the man had been, for the most part, taciturn and had drooled quite a lot from time to time. That he had taken it upon himself to rescue swimmers at sea, occasionally against their will, and for some reason had opted to run off to Paris with Jean Noel's grandmother, rather than to accompany Natalie to Los Angeles in her time of need, did, likewise, not bode well.
And the fact that Natalie then went on to lie about Byron to Jean Noel for his entire life also spoke volumes. That his mother should prefer to fabricate a far-fetched and patently ludicrous story about the man's having been carried out to sea by a rogue wave while walking his dog on the beach did little more than serve to underscore the embarrassment Natalie evidently felt in regard to this Ursine character. Even if he was possessed of a certain rustic charm, still in all he was apparently sadly lacking in verbal skills, and therefore, presumably, in wit, or even a modicum of sophistication.
As far as Jean Noel tried, he could never imagine Natalie, Zuzu, and Byron all living together in a small, isolated goat house on the Big Sur coast. For all her love of the arcane and the occult, Natalie seemed to be far too studious and level-headed to have ever found herself caught in such a predicament in life, even if it could be attributed to her youth. Jean Noel understood only too well how the heavy demands of dental school may have been a contributing factor to her making rash decisions, and he could therefore never be the one to cast the first stone.
No, it was Zuzu's subsequent behavior that puzzled Jean Noel far more. Why had Zuzu never acknowledged the reality of Byron when she had obviously known him so long gave Jean Noel pause. It was as if Byron had never existed, and it begged the question of why a man as simple and sweet as his father should be so cruelly relegated to the dustbin of history. And finally, there was the issue of Byron's premature demise of unknown causes in Paris a mere 5 years later. If Zuzu had seen fit to bury Byron in some fancy cemetery on the banks of the Seine, as Christie O'Keefe had claimed, then perhaps she had held the man in high esteem, to some degree at least, after all. Of course, there was always a possibility that she had merely wished to assuage her own sense of guilt.
Even as the ghosts of these weird possibilities and unsavory questions wandered the hallway and haunted the darkest recesses of Jean Noel's imagination for 2 unimaginably long days, the realization at last dawned that the time for rumination was over and it was time to go home, and that's what he had to do. He suddenly found himself wanting nothing more than the ordinary certainty of Alice and the pedestrian security of their family of cats. He wanted to forget all about the enchanted golden plumes served with ambrosia sauce being beaten on the terrace of Nepenthe with its wild and rugged view of the south coast, and to have instead an earthly bowl of carrot soup at La Marmottan, with a humble view of the area theater across the street. He wanted to divorce himself from any sordid details that cluttered his past, and listen instead to Alice exclaim with delight over the shoebox full of childhood photos he had left for her perusal. Momentarily lost in happy revelry, he abruptly remembered the promise he had made to Alice just before his departure, that he would take her friend Elvith to lunch at the Fandango in Pacific Grove. There, perhaps, under the watchful eye of the dancers of Bougival, with Edith Piaf warbling in the background, an element of sanity might yet be introduced to what he hoped would not evolve into a meaningless fiasco. There's plenty more where that came from, kids.